Good morning, and thank you for being here with us. Yesterday, our country woke up to the tragic news of another mass shooting, this time in Las Vegas. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers go out to those who are killed and injured by this heinous act of violence and those affected by it. The attacker was found to have more than 19 guns, including at least 2 automatic rifles. And as Democrats have been urging and saying for a long time, we need to do more to make the indiscriminate killing of human beings less easy, if that makes sense. Perhaps not a very poetic way of saying it, but we need to be doing more on the epidemic of gun violence in this country. And it just baffles me that some of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle don't agree with that basic premise. Until Congress makes it harder for dangerous people to acquire assault weapons, large magazine rounds, tragedies like this, unfortunately, are going to continue to happen. We need to have that discussion on gun safety. We hear it from our constituents pleading with us to do something, to act. And every time we see one of these tragedies, we hear from the Republican side of the aisle, now is not the time. Now is the time. We are tired of the bloodshed, and we're tired of the loss of life. Joining me this morning, I have several colleagues. We have Mike Thompson from California, who is the chair of our Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, to talk about what's next following yesterday's tragedy in Las Vegas. We also have Elizabeth Esty from the state of Connecticut, also involved very much in the discussion on gun violence and violence prevention. So I would ask them to please step forward at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Mike Thompson from California's 5th Congressional District, and I'm the chair of the Task Force on Gun Violence Prevention. Ms. Sanchez explained what happened yesterday quite well. I think it's important to point out the absolute volume of the horror yesterday. There were more people killed in Las Vegas in this shooting than have been killed in any one day in either the Iraq or the Afghanistan war. It's also important to note that yesterday's mass murder marks the 272nd time that we've experienced a mass shooting this year. Things are absolutely out of control. And our caucus is united in what we're asking for. One, the Republicans need to drop their dangerous, wrong-headed gun agenda that they're pushing this year. Their bill to deregulate the sale of silencers and their bill to make it easier to conceal carry in the United States of America. Both dangerous pieces of legislation. The Republicans need to have hearings and have a vote on our common sense gun violence prevention legislation, and that is our bill to expand background checks to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent criminals and the dangerously mentally ill from getting their hands on guns. And third, the Republicans need to allow us to have a select committee on gun violence prevention. Ever since Sandy Hook, we've been working tirelessly to try and figure out how to prevent gun violence or help prevent gun violence. No matter what we come forward with, the Republican majority has said no. Well, if they've got a better idea, please bring it out. Let's have a vote on that. And a way to do that is to convene a select committee so we can evaluate all of the different ideas and hear from experts and move forward with an agenda that will continue to protect our Second Amendment rights, but at the same time help keep our communities more safe. No one knows more about that than our colleague Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut. Before she was even sworn into office after she was elected, she had to confront gun violence in her own area, the massacre at Sandy Hook. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Esty to you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'm Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut's 5th District. representing, among other communities, Newtown. Yesterday, America saw an outdoor concert that had become a killing field. They can add that to the list of other killing fields in America. First grade classrooms in Sandy Hook, theaters in Aurora, nightclubs, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, a church in Charleston. When is it going to be time? Yesterday, members of our caucus went and spoke to Paul Ryan, asked him to allow us to have a select committee, asked him to allow us to move forward, and the answer was no. The time is now. As my colleague Mike Thompson said, these are more deaths yesterday than in war. And frankly, the American people expect and demand and should demand that we take action. There are common sense proposals. They've been on the table for almost 5 years now. We have not been allowed a single vote. And that's what we're asking for, a vote on common sense proposals like background checks, and to convene a bipartisan select committee to deal with this crisis in America. It's not just the mass shootings. Robin Kelly this morning spoke about the deaths every day in Chicago and in cities across America, deaths that in fact have become so pedestrian, so ordinary that they don't even get reported. We should be outraged. No other country has this happen. We can do better. We must do better. If we can address the opioid crisis, if we can address terrorism, we can and must address and do better on gun violence. Thank you very much, and I turn it back to our co-chair.
Thank you. Joining me this morning is also the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who's going to be talking about the upcoming DREAM Act DACA renewal deadline. Michelle?
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, and thanks to Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus. While I'm going to be speaking about the DACA renewal deadline and the DREAM Act, I do just want to add this. We all represent communities and districts and states where people believe and they're right, that they have a protected constitutional right to be safe in their own communities. And we are not having the right conversations here. And in that effort, where we're working tirelessly to make sure that every population that deserves our attention and our protection is getting both those things every day. So on September 5th, the President and Homeland Security joined together to arbitrarily rescind DACA, set a 6-month deadline for Congress to act, but did very little leadership, including that the renewal for DACA protection is a 30-day window. So they gave individuals a 30-day window, more than 150,000. They didn't take into consideration that we've had a series of natural disasters that have created huge impacts for folks just to deal with government services in their own communities. They aren't dealing with the fact that for a lot of folks, particularly now with the kind of uncertainty, people have left school, they've left their jobs, and remember, to be protected under DACA, you have to be working, going to school, serving in the military. We set a pretty high standard. That standard gets indiscriminately removed. Individuals' lives are upended. The ability to pay nearly a $500 fee in this 30-day window, almost impossible. So what I really want to do by virtue of this press conference is two things. One is to remind everyone that in spite of the fact that you have not been given enough time, so for dreamers and your families, do everything you can to make sure that whatever paperwork is still withstanding, that you get that submitted. And we're going to keep working to make sure that we get the DREAM Act passed. I also want to highlight that members of Congress have asked the Hispanic Caucus, the Democratic Caucus, individual members have gone to Homeland Security. In fact, I know for a fact that Leader Pelosi has been engaged in meetings with the acting director asking for an extension given all of the circumstances, and they have refused. And so we want to make sure that everyone, we think at least 50,000 individuals are still struggling to get that paperwork together. And if they don't get this done by October 5th, which is right now, then as we move forward with the DREAM Act, they're not going to be covered and that means they could be subject to deportation. So it's really important to report and remind them. And there are a variety of advocacy organizations that they can contact in their own communities and states who are standing ready to help them. And with that, I appreciate so much the opportunity to talk with you today and turn it right back over to the Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus, Linda Sanchez.
Thank you, Michelle. We will now open it up for questions. Yes?
Good morning. You said you're baffled at why folks can't get us around this, and I would like to hear from all of you, particularly Mr. Thompson, Ms. Espin, here. But the question is, why, when you guys had the protest on the floor last year, that didn't advance the issue? I don't know that any member has been elected on a gun policy issue since Carolyn McCarthy in Long Island, after the Long Island Railroad shooting in the 1990s. This issue doesn't seem to help you get the House or the Senate back. So why does this issue remain in this cryogenic freeze? Is that not on the Democrats if this issue is so important?
We don't control the floor schedule. We don't get to choose what bills come up for votes. The Republicans have the sole power to do that. We can't even get hearings. We can't even get studies on gun violence, the number of incidences in the country, what potentially could prevent them. Because we don't control the schedule for hearings or markups or votes on the floor, we are stuck. We have asked time and time again our Republican counterparts to please engage in this discussion of how do we stop gun violence, and they are completely unwilling to do anything to help us move forward on that issue. And I'll defer to Mr. Thompson.
Well,
Ms.
let me
Estes.
just clarify. It's not that we can't get scientific medical research done. It's that the majority party took that away and is not allowing that to happen. I call your attention to the bill, the background check bill last year, the King-Thompson bill. Peter King, Republican, bipartisan bill, over 193, I think, co-authors. And, you know, run the numbers. I doubt if there are any gun bills in the history of this Congress that have had 193 bipartisan co-authors. You know, this is a very, very divisive issue. We've asked for the Speaker to put together a select committee to bring Democrats and Republicans together and see if we can figure out a way to reduce the terrible issue of gun violence. The answer has been no. You're asking the wrong people the question.
But why doesn't that make an impact at the ballot box? If you don't have the
I think it does. Look at the numbers. The polling numbers are pretty overwhelmingly on our side. You know, I think it's 82% of NRA members believe we should have background checks. 90% of the American people believe we should have background checks. More people in the United States believe in background checks than believe in capitalism. So we're on the right side on this issue. The roadblock is right here in the Congress of the United States. They, as Linda said, they set the agenda. They can bring this up anytime for a vote. We have not been allowed a hearing. We've not been allowed a vote. They have throttled this issue since day number one.
And I would say, follow the money. You know, the NRA and the Gun Owners of America have spent a lot of money to try to change the narrative. And there's been a lack of political courage on the part of a lot of folks in Congress who know they ought to be able to do better. I ask anybody in America if they think 30,000 Americans dying a year from guns is okay, if that's something we should accept as the new normal, if 59 people killed in a matter of minutes should be acceptable. So we are coming together to try to deal with the opioid crisis. We should be on this. But unfortunately, big money is involved, and that is calling the tune right now, and it's wrong, and it should stop.
And I should add, if on the other side of this is, look at what their gun agenda is. Their gun agenda is deregulate the sale of silencers. And if you don't think this is just ridiculous, read the title of the bill, the Hearing Protection Act of 2017. If it wasn't so serious and so dangerous, it'd be laughable. And then the other bill is their concealed carry. If you have a concealed carry permit any place, you can carry concealed anywhere. And, some places, all you have to do to be able to qualify to carry a concealed weapon is to be able to legally buy it. So that means that 18-year-olds with nothing other than they legally purchased a handgun can carry it concealed in your neighborhood. They're wrong on this issue. Their agenda's wrong. Sportsmen and women across this country, responsible gun owners across this country, understand that, and they need to speak out. We need to have laws in place that will do everything possible to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and the dangerously mentally ill.
Continuing on that, specifically in terms of what you can do in Congress, and if the majority won't have hearings or votes for what you're proposing, what options do you have? Specifically, you did the sit-in, that didn't work. What can you do specifically in the Capitol?
It's similar to the question on DREAM Act. They refuse to act. They refuse to bring a bill that I think has overwhelming support to the floor. Public sentiment must begin to change the minds of those that are elected. There must be real consequences for those who are elected and choose to sit on their hands rather than pitch in and try to help reduce gun deaths and gun injuries in this country. There are not a lot of legislative options that are available to us. There are, discharge petitions, but we can't seem to find profiles and courage on the Republican side to join us in those. Again, we have been unable to convince the majority who controls the agenda to even allow simple hearings on the issue. How can you work on a problem or solve a problem if you have a side that's completely unwilling to even discuss the problem or discuss options for solving the problem? And that's where we need responsible gun owners across this country to stand up and say, hey, I'm a gun owner. I enjoy sporting, hunting, whatever the case may be. But I agree that there ought to be common sense protections here for the American public, or we are going to continue to see there's a mass shooting almost every single day in this country. And it's become so mundane that oftentimes you don't even hear about them. But it is an epidemic, just as bad as the opioid epidemic. And yet we cannot seem to get the other side to recognize that they have a responsibility to govern and to govern responsibly. Yes.
Well, DACA, Congressman, as you probably know, the president met yesterday with some GOP senators to talk about a DACA fix. As you say that Ryan is not willing to move anything here, and you have pushed for your discharge petition, do you think that in the end, as time gets closer to the deadline, you will have to make some concessions and maybe talk about the Succeed Act that's going on that they've introduced in the Senate?
We have yet to even hear their opening offer on, we would love to see Clean Dream Act passed. We have yet to even receive the opening offer from the administration on DACA or DREAM. So we expect that they will have something by the end of the week to us, and that's where the discussion jumping off point will begin. Yes.
Given the limitations that we've kind of already discussed on the issue of guns, some of your members said that they would like to attempt some sort of protest or a sit-in replicating the efforts you guys have done before. Is that something you guys are seriously considering, or how do you move forward?
We had a caucus meeting this morning where members brought to the caucus different ideas. The ideas of sit-ins were not part of that discussion. That's helpful. Yes.
Congress passed gun legislation in the 1990s. What do you think has changed since then that nothing can get done in this issue?
Well, I don't think a lot has changed. If you remember, I think the bill you're talking about is the background check bill, and it took 6 years and 7 votes. We're on par, I guess. We've been working on it for almost 5 years, and we've had no votes. So if we're allowed some votes on this thing, I think you'll see the expansion of background checks come into play. We're not asking to do some earth-shattering piece of legislation. All we're saying is, right now, if you buy a gun through a licensed dealer, you have to undergo a background check. We're expanding it to say if you buy a gun through the commercial sale, you have to have a background check. We know background checks work. We know that some 70 felons a day try and buy a gun through licensed dealers and are turned down. 50 domestic abusers a day try and buy a gun through a licensed dealer and they're turned down. These same criminals can walk out the door, go to a gun show in some states, or go on the internet in some states and buy the exact same gun that they weren't allowed to buy in the gun store. We think that's wrong. We think it should be expanded. We know it'll save lives.
Yes.
All of that said, and recognizing that a lot of the details from Las Vegas we don't know yet, it sounds like this guy did pass background checks. And now we're hearing a lot from Republicans saying, well, how would your bill prevent something like this from happening? Are there other issues that you would like to look at in terms of reform besides the background check that might have prevented this?
Here's the deal. You can't legislate based on the last disaster. If you take that focus, we're never going to get anywhere. We know that background checks work. We should pass those and get that done. We know that, sadly, the only time mass shootings generate these types of questions and attention is if it's 59 people or 20 little kids in a schoolhouse. But remember, this is the 272nd mass shooting this year. Every day, 30 people are killed in the United States of America by someone using a gun. We know that background checks work. It's not going to prevent anybody from buying a gun unless they're a criminal or they're dangerously mentally ill. It's not taking anybody's guns away. It's well within the confines of the Second Amendment. There's no threat to this. But as you also know, it's a tough needle to thread. This is a good spot to start. It will save lives, and we ought to get on with it.
The American people last year voted for things to get done. They're tired of gridlock in Washington. And this is a unique opportunity for this new administration and this majority party to show that they're serious about understanding what the American people asked for. Do the common sense things. And we know that background checks work. What's changed in the last 20 years? We have the internet, and a lot of guns are sold over the internet now. There is effectively no regulation of that now. How many people here buy things on Amazon every day? Americans buy things online all the time, and now it's guns. We've made it way too easy. We have allowed a huge loophole to open up here, and the most responsible thing we can do is at least close that one down. Start with something. It doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing is going to stop all deaths. We know this works. It's stopped 2.6 million sales since the passage of the background check bill. 2.6 million. That's a lot of lives saved.
Right. And I might just add that that's why the Select Committee is so important, because this is a public health issue. If you want to address a public health issue, then you have to start looking at the epidemic of gun violence in this country. Then you can have meaningful, reasonable responses, not only potentially out of Congress, but you create an environment where states who have been leading on background checks and common sense gun legislation, then they have the research and information to do even more, which unfortunately in this kind of gridlock is the kind of public sentiment that moves Congress, and we'll do all of the above if it does something about making our communities safer.
Yes.
You talked about some of your members meeting with Speaker Ryan yesterday to ask for the Select Committee. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Who went to see the Speaker? How did that conversation go?
Mr. Thompson.
All I can tell you is John Lewis was the member. He asked if the Speaker would join the Democrats in a show of unity and a show of action to deal with this. And we're told in caucus today that the response was, if it has to do with policy, it's a non-starter.
So, Mr. Lewis specifically asked for a Select Committee?
Correct. I think Mr. Lewis asked for a show of action, a show of unity and a show of action. Leader Pelosi asked for the Select Committee, and as I'm sure you know and have read word for word and clung on every word, I have the legislation to do that.
Yes.
Given the president's recent deal-making with Democrats, does Democratic leadership have any plans to make sort of a direct appeal to the president on this issue, maybe bypass Congress or?
Yes, the Task Force on Gun Violence Prevention has drafted legislation that's being circulated amongst our members today, asking specifically that the president join us. And we outline the fact that for almost 5 years, we've been stonewalled. There have been no hearings. There have been no votes. We highlight the most recent tragedy and also the 30-some lives a day that are lost at the hand of someone with a gun. We ask him to join us and try and figure out a solution to help prevent gun violence. That letter will go out today.
I know you said earlier that the topic of sit-ins didn't come up in the caucus. Why do you guys think that is? Do you not think that that's a winning method in this fight?
Well, based on the overwhelming public response we got from the last sit-in, clearly it galvanized America's attention on gun violence. There have been issues with regard to complaints filed with the Ethics Committee for engaging in those sit-ins and rules of the House, which the Speaker seems intent on enforcing. So we don't know that, if we were to.
And the other thing also is you have to remember that sit-in wasn't orchestrated by our caucus. That was as
Spontaneous.
organic as you can imagine. That just came from a bunch of members who said, enough, the Republicans aren't allowing us hearings and a vote on our bill. People are being murdered every day. We want to take some action. So that was a very organic activity. No one sat down in caucus or in some little room and planned it out.
Yeah. So I think at this point, probably not the best course of action for Democrats to take. We want to continue to highlight our request, which we think is a very reasonable one for a select committee to study the issue. Yes.
Last question.
Back on DACA, given the difficulties you've described dealing with the majority and the deal making that the Democratic leadership had with the president, do you have confidence in the composition or even the intent of Speaker Ryan's task force on fixing DACA, or confidence? Do you even expect to hear something back that you'll be able to work with?
Well, it's interesting because we keep hearing that a number of issues are bipartisan. For example, tax reform. We've not been invited to the table to speak. So they have had this strategy, much as they did with healthcare, of go it alone. They sit in a room amongst themselves, they talk to themselves, they come up with a product that not even their caucus can support and get behind 100%, and then they want to tell us this is what the final result is going to be and allow us to vote on their product. We believe that this issue, a majority of Americans support wholeheartedly. We believe that we have a seat at that table and should be in those discussions. And whether or not the Speaker opens that up for Democratic participation is his sort of prerogative, but I guarantee you that their go-it-alone strategy has not been successful on health care. It won't be successful on tax reform, and I don't think that it'll be successful on DREAM. And when we met with the president last week to talk about tax reform for the first time,
The day before they introduced this.
right, the day before they introduced their proposal, which he kept saying, what a great bipartisan meeting, but again, it was the first. We pushed him to get engaged on DREAM Act because we believe the Speaker will not move on DREAM Act. As much as he loves to talk about his Catholic faith and his, empathy and sympathy for these very talented kids, he refuses to move. And so we are hoping that the president will get engaged and begin to push their caucus to work with us. We think that the American people want bipartisanship. They want both sides working to solve problems, not just a party that refuses to act and says no. So we'll see.
On the 2018 midterms, how comfortable are you in running on a solid gun control platform, particularly in states where you want to see a pickup in some of these purplish areas?
Well, in case you hadn't heard, our agenda for the 2018 midterms is a better deal agenda, talking about better jobs, better wages, and a better future for the American families. That will be the framework that we discuss all other issues under. But first and foremost, it's an economic agenda that speaks to the real needs of America's working families. And while for some members, gun violence will be a platform that they will talk a lot about. We want to emphasize the fact that Democrats have and always will continue to stand with working families, and that's the framework in which we will discuss the 2018 midterms. Thank you.